for tonight's episode, a special episode, a special report on what's going on and in Ukraine, as well as what's going on in Washington, D.C. and in Canada. And this flagrant anti-Semitism just never seems to end. For you who are new, who are just joining us tonight, please watch us frequently on Sunday evenings at 7:30, some other times due to special reports, and find us on israelnow.ca, as well as share us, like us, and just join in the conversation on Facebook and on our YouTube channel. Meir is always our host, and I'm hiding out here in the studios. We have some special guests with us tonight joining us. It's always a pleasure to have Meir Jolovitz, who's a Middle East analyst, lecturer, educator, columnist, and he's the past national chairman of the Jewish Defense League, as well as the past national executive director of the Zionist Organization of America. And read in various Jewish sources he publishes in. Also joining us this evening is David Schoen. David is an attorney at law, and he is actually presently the director of the Zionist Organization of America. He was also as a lead counsel in President Trump's impeachment defense team, as well as victims of PLO terror, where he actually went after and successfully got financial rewards from American victims of PLO terror. He's also the recipient of the prestigious Israel Migdal or Tower of Light Award. So unfortunately, tonight's show is just showing the terrible atrocities happening in the Ukraine. And we'll go over a little bit of history for about 5 minutes before we bring on Meir and then our guests. It is a special edition tonight, and the special edition is the crisis in Ukraine. And then we have the trio meeting. We have Putin, along with Iran meeting. And as we know that President Biden seems to be concerned about the resolve of the Iranian people. We'll get more about that later. There he is snoozing in that little trio. Ukraine certainly can be viewed as quite beautiful and majestic all times of year, winter and summer, but don't let it fool you. There's a lot of turmoil and stress and going on there for decades, for hundreds of years, actually. And it's amazing that Zelensky, a Jew, actually won the popular vote by over 70%. Meanwhile, as Russia continues to pound away at the Ukraine, that's a nursery on the right-hand corner. And Zelensky is trying his best to keep morale boosted and fight off this treacherous enemy. But it's interesting for me to note that, not to give Putin a pass because he's using an excuse, but we have a president who's Jewish in a country with known neo-Nazi parties. So if we look back at the history of the Ukraine and Jews in the Ukraine, it's just a little tiny place, but we've lived there for thousands of years, and many distinctive Jewish theology actually started in the Ukraine. For a short period of time, very short indeed, between about 1917 and 1920, Jews were regarded as normal Ukrainian citizens. Not only that, but the official currency of Ukraine was written in Ukrainian Russian as well as Yiddish. Again, this was a 3-year period in the midst of constant anti-Semitism. By the 11th century, there were Jews living in Kiev, but surprisingly, it wasn't until 1648 that they started slaughtering us. The first of the most major Cossack uprisings occurred in 1648, went on for a dozen years, where over 100,000 Jews were slaughtered in the Ukraine. So my question for this evening is, why would any Jew want to live in Ukraine? Surprisingly, in this same time period of the early Cossack raids, the Baal Shem Tov was born in Ukraine. And he gave rise to a Jewish spiritual revival movement now known as Hasidism. And again, that's in 1698 in the midst of flagrant, murderous Cossack attacks against the Jews. There were early barbaric slaughters by proud Russian Cossacks in the Russian Empire against Jews. These are just a partial list of some of the time periods where Jews were slaughtered in the land that's now Ukraine. And it didn't end. The Cossacks continued pretty much to this very day. My grandfather is from the Ukraine, from a little town called Kuzmin, and he witnessed Cossacks on horseback slicing the heads off Jewish children when he was a child. Despite the barbaric bigotry, sadistic slaughters, and psychopathic disregard for Jewish life, at the turn of the last century, Ukraine was home to 2.6 million Jews. And when people say you don't look Jewish, well, what does a Jew look like? Some of the early Ukrainian Jews. And then the page turned, and a new generation of anti-Semitism swept the country. Pogrom after pogrom after pogrom. Again, I ask, why would a Jew want to live in Ukraine? That's a mystery to me. And then, of course, the Holocaust hit hard in the Ukraine, where we can see the concentration camps, the ghettos, the murders. On September 6th, 1941, this was posted. And just in the interest of time and the fact that I can't read Russian, we'll proceed to the English translation. Which reads as follows. All Yids of the city of Kiev and its vicinity must appear on Monday, the 29th of September by 8 o'clock in the morning at these corners in this street and bring documents, money, valuables, and warm clothing. They were led to believe they were being transferred to other places for Jews to live. Any Yids who did not follow this order were shot, and anyone who's ransacking the homes of these Yids will be shot because they wanted the homes for the Ukrainian Nazis. Was this treacherous day in September 1941? They weren't being sent to new homes. They were being slaughtered at Babi Yar. On September 29, 1941, 33,771 Jews were murdered at Babi Yar. The decision to kill all the Jews in Kiev was aided by the voluntary Ukrainian auxiliary police. So this was not just the Russian Empire, this was the people of Ukraine. I'll continue to ask all evening, why would a Jew want to live in Ukraine? They lined them up, they shot them, and they pushed them into graves. And Ukraine has never done an investigation of the atrocities Ukrainians performed during the Holocaust. So a memorial site was set up at Babi Yar in Ukraine in order to never forget and never again the atrocities that happened there. But then, a couple of days ago, bombs hit the region, hit the area.
A grisly symbol of Putin's desire to wipe
people.
Sorry, we got a little glitch there, but we'll get back to where we were. Again, to stress the point that this wasn't just Nazis. This was voluntary Ukrainians who were aiding in the treacherous, murderous attack on 33,000 Jews. Okay, back where we were, back to the memorial in Babi Yar. To memorialize and never again those 33,000, as well as all the Jews who perished in the Holocaust.
A grisly symbol of Putin's desire to wipe Ukraine off the map, his army is targeting cultural sites, and in a sick twist, after the Russian leader spoke of denazifying Ukraine, the Russian military bombed the Holocaust Memorial in Kyiv, a reminder that nothing is off limits.
It's important to note that 100,000 Ukrainians voluntarily joined a local Nazi police force during the Holocaust. Ukrainian civilians staffed the local offices and participated in the shooting of Ukrainian Jews. Holocaust massacres in Ukraine happened not only in ancient times, but throughout the Holocaust. They had Jews dig their own graves, and then they would shoot them and put them into the graves that the Jews themselves had to dig. And of course, let's not forget the camaraderie between Hitler and the Grand Mufti, and there was denial of this for decades. So there we have a little transition there. Not much difference, really, between the Grand Mufti and the Grand Ayatollah. And of course, who's taking the position now of the allegedly neutral party? There we have Putin. And in the middle, we have Biden, who's snoozing through the entire episode. And what does Biden have to say?
So let us continue to draw inspiration from the iron will of the Ukrainian people. To our fellow Ukrainian Americans who forged the deep bond that connects our two nations, we stand with you. We stand with you. Putin may circle Kyiv with tanks, but he'll never gain the hearts and souls of the Iranian people.
What? What did you say? I missed that.
But he'll never gain the hearts and souls of the Iranian people.
What? I can't. One more time. What did you say?
But he'll never gain the hearts and souls of the Iranian people.
I don't think
he'll never gain the hearts and souls of the Iranian people.
I don't think that's a priority in the present conflict. But having said that, let's move on. Remember what Einstein said, the world is a dangerous place not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing. And I would have to say that in this particular conflict, offering sanctions is doing nothing. Continuing to buy petroleum products from Russia is not only doing nothing, it's aiding and abetting the enemy. So without any further ado, let's introduce Meir. Please do support us, join us, share us, and visit us on israelnow.ca.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And please let me ask you if you could share the link, share this show on your different social media platforms, be it Facebook, groups on Facebook, pages on Facebook, friends accounts, also on Twitter, on Instagram, whatever social media platform you're on. Please share this. We'll reach a lot more people, have a stronger impact. These are historic times going on right now. Watching it by the minute. It's incredible what's going on. We're going to be talking about the situation in the Ukraine today and how it affects the Jewish community, the Jewish people, and Israel. And we're also going to be talking about the Iranian nuclear deal, which could possibly be signed as we're speaking, in fact, tonight. It's a very dangerous deal that's being talked about. And we'll be discussing that. And also, if anyone has any questions or comments, we have an active chat, so you could certainly type in your question or concern or comment, and we'll do our best to address it as well. This week's parsha is called Parshat Pekudi, and I'll be very brief with it. There is a lesson. There's a lesson every single parsha. It just starts off in this parsha. These are the accounts of the Mishkan of testimony. What was the Mishkan? What do you mean, these are the accounts? Well, the Mishkan was the tabernacle that the Jewish people were commanded to build in the wilderness as they were marching to their ultimate destination, Israel. The Mishkan was to be a mini Beis Hamikdash, a mini temple. And the ultimate craftsman, the architect of it, who was selected, who's throughout this parsha, Betzalel, talks about him. He took on a leadership. He was the next generation of leaders, and he understood what had to be. And he was called Betzalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, and very unique that they go back to his grandfather in the selection of who would be the architect, because his grandfather Hur took an incredible stand. He reached the zenith of Kiddush Hashem. He stood up against the Jews who wanted to worship the golden calf, and he was stoned to death for doing that. He risked his life to say the truth and what should be. And who better to pick as the architect for the Mishkan? Not just a smart person and capable person, and indeed he was, but someone that would have that indestructible faith and vision and would never be deterred for the truth. Why does it start off, these are the accounts of the Mishkan? Why do we have to always, what's going on here? Because in the previous parsha, we talked about different aspects of the Mishkan being built, and the previous parsha before that, and we talked also about the vestments and the clothing of the Kohanim, the priesthood. Why the repetition? Because we have to remember what was the ultimate reason why we even had to build the Mishkan. Had to build the Mishkan because we had to remind ourselves, Jewish people had to remind themselves of the sin of the golden calf. The Mishkan was an atonement for the sin of the golden calf. You had to go through the intricacies, how to build it precisely the right way, and to be a blessing for the Jewish people. And the temple, the way it's construed and built in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, is to be absolute perfection to the last detail. Throughout the Torah, we're told to remember how it was in Egypt. Remember our past. There's a conflict going on today with Russia and the Ukraine. And there's attempts to whitewash history. When the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada attends a rally for the Ukraine in Toronto and holds a banner that is the banner of the Bandera movement, that's a neo-Nazi movement from the Ukraine. They call it a nationalist movement. No, the Bandera movement has a history of involvement during the Holocaust. We can't forget these things. No matter how much people want to say or whitewash it. I remember in the 1980s when the Duchesne Commission was set up by the Conservative government in Canada, the Mulroney government. The Duchesne Commission to investigate whether there are Nazi war criminals living in Canada or not. And I was working on that issue, very involved with other Nazi hunters, and I was testifying at that commission. And I remember I came prepared with private investigators and other researchers to give testimony and evidence about Nazi war criminals living in Canada, suspects living in Canada. And we had affidavits, and we had all kinds of evidence, and primarily was evidence about collaborators from Romania, from the Romanian Iron Guard. But I was questioned by a lawyer representing the Ukrainian community, and he asked me if I was also going to testify about anyone from the Ukraine who I would be concerned of accusing them of committing war crimes, being a Nazi collaborator. So I wasn't there that day to testify about Ukrainian Nazi war criminals or collaborators. The Simon Wiesenthal Center had a dossier and had a lot of information. I've seen the list, and I had the list as well, one of the lists anyways, of those from the Ukraine. Here's the thing. The UN had a list of organizations that collaborated with the Nazis. And they said that they listed the Galician Waffen SS from the Ukraine as being an organization, membership in this organization, you were a Nazi collaborator. So there were thousands of members of the Galician Waffen SS that emigrated to Canada. And the Simon Wiesenthal Center published a lot of information about that. And that was a big issue. After I testified at the Duchesne Commission, I had that encounter with a lawyer representing the Ukrainian community because they were saying, just go after individuals. You can't blanket an entire organization, say membership in an organization makes you a Nazi war criminal. And that was their presentation to, and they really pushed hard with the Duchesne Commission on that issue. I remember I wanted to learn a little bit more about the Ukrainian community. So I went to their main organization in Toronto, their headquarters for Canadian Ukrainians in Toronto. And I went through the halls just to see, what kind of literature they have, and they had statues there of who they considered Ukrainian heroes. Khmelnytsky, Petlura, and Bandera. These were all people who glorified massacring Jews. That's what I saw, proudly displayed in their hallways. So when there's going to be a rally here in Toronto for the Ukraine, and there's going to be banners for the Bandera movement or other movements that it's been reported, in fact, in the media, there's no secret of neo-Nazi movements that are in the military in the Ukraine. It's no secret. So we can't sugarcoat anything, what's going on in the Ukraine. And we have a history in the Ukraine of Jews being massacred. And so when the media picks up on a story and says that Putin bombed Babi Yar, and there's a report from an Israeli journalist who went there, and he took pictures, and he said the actual memorial wasn't affected at all. But who is responsible for? I'm not whitewashing anything Putin does either, at all. But who is responsible for the massacre of Jews at Babi Yar? Those were Ukrainian Nazis. And many Ukrainian Nazis operated the death camps as well. Anyways, we have a lot to talk about tonight. We have Mayor Jolovitz with us, and we're going to be talking about, what's going on in the Ukraine and what the Jewish responsibility should be, and also, more importantly, the Iran nuclear deal. Iran wants to drop a bomb on Israel. They want to develop nuclear arms so they could drop a bomb on Israel and murder every single Jew in Israel. And in the Jewish community, there are Jews who actually want to fly to the Ukraine and fight in the Ukraine. No, our focus has to be on the survival of Israel, to be strong, and to resist this deal that Netanyahu, when he was prime minister, is on record saying it's 1939 and Iran is Germany, and they're working to build a nuclear bomb to destroy Israel. Meir, how are you doing tonight?
A pleasure to join you. A most important issue. Let me begin with this, if I may, just to sort of set the stage. I've been lecturing on Israeli affairs for 45 years. And the message throughout that 45 years has been basically quite simple in suggesting the following. The truth is not always self-evident. It's remarkable how we take for granted, we just assume, well, once the truth is spoken, everything is going to fall into place. Yeah. And for the 45 years that I've been doing this, the one obvious observation is that the lessons of history are never learned. In fact, it was someone who once said that the only lesson of history is that there are no lessons that were learned from history. But the more troubling thing that underscores what I'm talking about is the truth is not always self-evident. And what I would like to concentrate on today, I realize time is precious, is the connection between the world's reaction to what we see now, albeit a very slow reaction. Let's not, for those people who tuned in and listened to the State of the Union address that was given by Biden yesterday, there was the suggestion, and it was a misbegotten one, that pretended that the United States was in the right place at the right time, saying the right things with all the support of all the nations of the world. That wasn't the case. It isn't the case. There is sort of a revisionist, literally before our eyes. We watched in the last week a revisionist version of history where all of a sudden the United States is talking about Ukraine and its nationalism and the fact that all citizens have the right to bear arms against evil and so on and so forth. That wasn't the case a week ago or 2 weeks ago, certainly a month ago. But as you said, Meir, in the very beginning, what I'm concerned about is, and I think that what many of the viewers here are concerned about is, how does this relate to Israel? And I'd like to address that issue as we proceed. Do you want me to just pick it up? And
absolutely, go ahead.
Okay. What's remarkable is, and you've given a strong history. If one was to play the other side, one could actually argue that notwithstanding the anti-Semitism, which was it was very much in evidence, certainly in the Ukraine and also in what the Soviet Union and later Russia. Earlier Russia, later Soviet Union, later Russia again. Anti-Semitism was endemic to both societies. No question about it. The one thing that one could say is that during the last half decade, there has been a drop in the level, the measure, the intensity of anti-Semitism that one would see. You mentioned Bibi Netanyahu. He has established a better relationship with, for example, Russia than Israel has ever had before. Certainly since the first week of Israel's existence, when the Soviets were hoping that Israel, by nature of its socialist-leaning culture, might become a part of the Soviet orbit and everything else. That, of course, didn't happen, even though socialism was somewhat prevalent at the time. But nonetheless, what's happening in Syria, we do see that the Israeli government has a much closer relationship with Putin. It's sort of an understanding of, we'll try to stay out of each other's ways, and everything will be fine. There's no question, for those of us who remember the marches, the protests that American Jews and others finally engaged in the early 1970s, it was because of the whole Free Soviet Jewry movement. At the time, Jews were being persecuted much more overtly than we had seen at other times. That was yesterday's news. Israel, in fact, has a better relationship, and it's a pragmatic one. It's a pragmatic one with Russia. Israel also has a somewhat better relationship with Ukraine, certainly given the history that you began the program with, to the point, as you mentioned, that it's that the leader of Zelensky of Ukraine is a Jew, and it was known that he was Jewish when he was a candidate. So one would say that the situation is better than it was yesteryear. And here comes all the however. However, the reality is that we are now witness to a world which was quite slow in getting into the situation and supporting the Ukrainians when they noticed that the Ukrainians were being brave in the defense of their nation. And what many of these so-called experts claimed was a somewhat slow attack on the part of the Russians. All of a sudden, all these so-called experts, and I preface on purpose the so-called, I qualified the so-called experts, all of a sudden thinking, oh, maybe this is something we can win. And all of a sudden, the Western world, the European Union have decided that they would engage in some kind of measure of support for Ukraine, but that's only because they think things are going their way.
Right.
Are they willing to actually invest in conflict, in combat with the Russians? The answer is no. And that's what I want to address today, if I may. There are a couple of very simple realities that we need to notice, and we'll see how, if and when Israel was ever to be confronted with the same challenge that Ukraine is confronting today, I think the world would have a very different reaction to it. Now, everyone is watching the news, everyone sees the same satellite photographs. They see a 40-mile-long convoy of military vehicles which are about to enter and encircle Kiev in order to take control of the capital, which is an important logistical element that needs to be undertaken by the Russians for them to declare victory at some level. And the question is asked by the military people, if there's a 40-mile-long convoy of military vehicles, they are actually a sitting target. We've seen the photographs. It's a long string of vehicles, which if they were attacked by fighter jets or by the planes, the jets, which are actually designed for such an attack, the A-10 and such, the Warthog, they could be completely eliminated. Why aren't they eliminated then if the West has the capability of saving Ukraine, confronting Russia, getting Russia to lose this engagement? Why aren't they engaging in a military conflict against this sitting duck of a 40-mile-long convoy? And the answer is simple. Everybody knows the answer. Because the Russians are nuclear capable. That's it. The Russians are nuclear capable. And the moment that a nation is nuclear capable, all rules are suspended. Now, one could look for a second also at North Korea. North Korea is an impoverished nation. For 25, 30 years, they've had a difficult time feeding their own citizens. There was a period of time where the CIA had reported that citizens in North Korea were actually eating grass. The situation was really, really a difficult situation. And yet North Korea presented, post-1994, 1995, they've presented a serious challenge to the free world, to the Western world, to South Korea, to the United States, to Japan. Why? Because it was a military threat to the others? No. The same answer. Because they were nuclear capable. And the moment that they became nuclear capable, notice that a superpower like the United States backs off. They take a step back. You don't attack a nation which is nuclear capable, and I will add this element, which has what the so-called experts call a deranged person in control. Which brings us to Iran. Iran, right now, as we speak, delegates from the United States, delegates from Iran, and it should be noted, and this is the irony of this conflict that the United States ostensibly has with Russia.
Yeah.
All of us, the Russians are sitting side by side with the Americans, negotiating with the Iranians in order to reestablish the Iran nuke deal, which was first brought into play in 2015, which was suspended by President Trump in 2018. And all of a sudden, the Western world, with Biden representing that Western world, says we want the deal back. That deal then, in 2015, had a sunset clause, which basically said that after a certain period of time, and that period, even the experts argued as to how long that period was, but it was supposed to be 12 years or so. After 12 years, the Iranians could, in fact, continue with the development of a nuclear military capability. Also, that deal, it should be pointed out, had no controls over the ICBMs, the missiles which would allow the Iranians to launch in a good part of the world, but certainly targeting Israel. What happens? We now have a situation where the present Biden administration, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, and the person in charge, most specifically the American envoy to Iran, Robert Malley, a Jew, a Jew, and they're deciding that they're desperate to have agreement and a deal. Now, let me point out something which is important. This isn't a treaty. If it was a treaty, it would have to go through congressional approval. So it's called a deal or an agreement, which doesn't have to go through Congress. So all of a sudden, we've got American negotiators. And who are those negotiators? Yes, indeed. They're the same people who negotiated the 2015 nuke deal with Iran. Even more so, let me throw another name in, Wendy Sherman. Wendy Sherman, Deputy Secretary of State. Where was Wendy Sherman first brought to our attention? 1994, when she assured us that negotiations with the North Koreans had produced an understanding that the North Koreans would never come into possession of a nuclear weapon. So much so that in 1994, and a very famous speech in 1995, President Clinton announced that there was a success on the foreign policy level where the North Koreans had, in essence, been neutralized. Well, Wendy Sherman is in Vienna negotiating this next deal as well. Let me bring this all together and connect the dots. There is going to be a deal, despite the fact that the Americans just 3 days ago said, we're losing our patience with the Iranians. If the Iranians don't sign this deal, we're going to pull out. And the Iranians know they're not going to pull out because the Americans are desperate for this deal. And the Iranians are going to have the deal. The deal gives them sunset clause, which means that they can be a breakout state capable of developing nuclear military arsenal in 2.5 years. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu has been complaining and screaming about this, and few people are listening to him because he's no longer in power. He's in opposition. And it's the same argument that was made when he was, in fact, prime minister, when he came to visit Congress and warned about this impending tragedy that could happen. Here's the question that needs to be asked, and nobody asks it. What happens if, in fact, the deal is signed, and it will be signed, and in the sunset clause 2.5 years from now, there is a breakthrough and the Iranians develop a nuclear military capability? Or, as some of the real experts will tell you, they won't wait the 2.5 years, because the moment the deal will be signed, the Iranians are going to start cheating the way they cheated as soon as the 2015 deal was signed. And by the way, it wasn't actually signed. That's the irony of the whole thing. So what do we have? We have a situation where Iran will, in fact, unless Iran, and we're talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran. It isn't just the Islamic Republic of Iran. There's everything Islamic about it. There's nothing Republic about it.
Right.
But they will, in fact, become a power unless they're stopped. And if they're not stopped, I now refer to that 40-mile-long convoy of weapons. I refer to North Korea. And the question is asked is, what happens when they become nuclear capable? And all of a sudden they threaten Israel, and the Western world will say, well, we can't really do anything about it because we have a madman, a deranged person, some ayatollahs, some mullahs in charge of a bomb, and they have told us that if the United States or any other Western country from Europe interferes, well, they're going to take out Saudi Arabia. They're going to take out the oil fields. They're going to take out Haifa. They're going to take out. And all of a sudden, the same restrictions that we find today in our inability or unwillingness to strike at Russia for the reasons which seem logical. They are nuclear capable. The same reason we haven't struck against North Korea, because they are nuclear capable. Oh my God, that same situation is going to develop in Iran. Game over. What's
Right.
Israel going to do? The answer, of course, is that Israel needs to end the Iranian threat before it becomes a deadly threat.
Right.
And instead we have the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese, and the Germans and the French all sitting down with the Iranians and coming up with terms which the Iranians are going to be happy to accept. That is the problem. So while the whole world is concentrating on Ukraine, and it is a situation that needs to be paid attention to, but the one thing that needs to be learned from the lesson of Ukraine is, look how the Western world is completely handcuffed in its ability to respond in a way that they'd like to respond, because the threat of the enemy that they would like to strike and cannot strike. And that situation will be much, much worse when you have a nation which publicly and quite often pronounces that our end game is the destruction of Israel.
So, Meir, here's a question. So, so it seems that most Jewish organizations today are getting involved with the Ukrainian issue. And we have the Iranian talks going on, nuclear talks going on. What's the response from organizations like AIPAC, different groups like that? I haven't really seen anything. I haven't heard anything.
Well, in the beginning, they were reluctant to come out because nobody knew exactly. Nobody wanted to be the first one to be the troublemaker in the block. Now that, as I said, the so-called experts have perceived the Russian invasion to be somewhat lackluster, and there's certainly a challenge to that opinion, they all of a sudden have become emboldened and said, we want to support the Ukrainians. How do they support the Ukrainians? They put the flag of the Ukrainians on Facebook. They will speak and everything else. It is nothing more than a cosmetic approach to the problem, which of course is relevant to this discussion again. What happens if Iran announces Iran explodes a testing, and Iran shows us in the year 2025 that it's nuclear capable? Israel is told by the United States, you can't strike. They're nuclear. We can't turn this into World War III. And all of a sudden, Iran realizes that they have the same power by virtue of a bomb that the Russians and the North Koreans today. What will AIPAC or the other Jewish organizations say? We know what they're going to say. They're going to tell Israel, you've got to push the right buttons in order to placate the enemy so the enemy can be somehow quieted. And that means Israel giving and the Muslims getting, which is the age-old formula. Now, allow me, if I may, I'm actually reaching down. Right before we went on, I went and I just checked 2 news stories. These are 2 news stories that came out just in the last 3 hours. I want to read you the headline. They each actually, they're symbiotically connected, but it plays to exactly what you just asked me, Meir. Here's the one headline. The headline is, Biden cancels test of the Minuteman III nuclear missiles to demonstrate restraint and avoid angering Putin after his nuclear threat, as Air Force puts on a show of force in Japan to deter China. Now that was the headline. So here it is, we have Biden deciding to cancel a demonstration of the powers of the Minuteman III missile, which is an effective tool in fighting a serious war against a superpower, in order to, and this is their words, this is the words of the American State Department, to demonstrate restraint and avoid upsetting Putin. Okay, well, Putin certainly has noticed that. If I can read this, Putin's read it, and Putin has just been emboldened. But it wasn't just Putin, because the second part of that headline was, as the United States Air Force puts on a show of force in Japan to deter China. What a joke. If China sees that the United States has canceled its own maneuvers in order to upset Putin, the show of force, which was nothing more than a photo op of a whole bunch of American Air Force fighters in an airport, in this particular case, China has noticed that the Americans have backed down. They've backed down. China has been emboldened. Putin has noticed that they're backed down. Here's the second headline that I want to bring into play. Second headline came out almost the same time, just 2 or 3 hours ago, and the headline is as follows. Putin is not crazy, and the Russian invasion is not failing. It continues, this is a long headline, the West's delusions about this war and its failures to understand the enemy will prevent it from saving the Ukraine, writes military analyst Bill Rozier, whatever, he's with the Foundation of Defensive Democracies. What this piece says is that the Americans, which is true of most of the analysts in the Western world, have once again miscalculated. Their assumption is that Putin is crazy and that he's losing the war, and therefore this is a good sign for us. First of all, their own premise leads them to the wrong conclusion. If Putin is crazy, then my God, they should be concerned. But this military analyst comes out and says, and I concur, by the way, Putin knows exactly what he's doing. The fact that it's not what we in the Western world would like to see doesn't make him insane. The reason he didn't do it a year ago or 3 years ago is because he didn't think the opportunity or that the circumstances were opportune, I should say, at the time. And we can obviously analyze that by saying, I wonder who the president was 3 years ago.
Of course.
Okay. And we see Afghanistan all of a sudden here. Let's reach up and bring Afghanistan into play. We now see the United States, a superpower, basically came out and said, our intelligence apparatus failed us. We had no idea that the Taliban, were as powerful as they were and as close to taking Kabul as they did. We thought it was going to give us some time. Well, if you admit, as the greatest superpower in the world, that your intelligence apparatus, all the agencies, failed you, by what right do you have today to say, well, our intelligence services tell, whatever you're about to tell me is irrelevant because you just told me that they failed you in August of last year. Okay, so let's just assume that's the case. But as far as the actual incursion into Ukraine, we're told, well, this is much slower than what Putin had planned for, and therefore this bolsters the morale of the Western world, which is true. It bolsters the morale. It doesn't mean he's not going to win. There's this idiotic connection of dots, which is an ill-begotten one, which basically says, well, because he's had a more difficult time with his initial incursion, surprised by the resolve of the Ukrainians, well, all of a sudden, people were talking on television 2 days ago. They were actually talking on television and saying, do you think Putin is going to be overthrown by his own? Do you think Putin is going to surrender? Do you think Putin, all of a sudden, they've got Russia losing and Ukraine winning. These people have no conception who Putin is. Putin is not going to allow himself to lose.
But also in the State of the Union speech by Biden, he made it clear the U.S. is not going to do anything militarily.
That's right. That's exactly right. We have told them, we've told Putin, if this is in fact a setback, let's assume that the analysts are right. The initial 3 days in Ukraine is a setback. Okay, well, any of us who remember, let's bring it close to home. If you looked at what happened after the first 12 hours in the Yom Kippur War, the 12 hours of the Yom Kippur War, my God, Israel, well, there are two ways to look at it. If you looked at the news stories that came out before the 1967 war, we all know that the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, began June 5th, 1967. If you listen to Walter Cronkite or any other political commentator speaking a week before the Israeli preemptive strike against Egypt, Israel was going to be destroyed. There was an impending Holocaust, and things changed. Israel, in that case, did what it needed to do, and it said, screw the world. We don't care if we're popular or not popular. We will survive. We won't only survive, we will be victorious. The notion of victory is something which has been removed from all Western, the whole nomenclature of Western discussion of military. They don't talk about victory. They talk about compromise. So let me go back to the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War, 1973, all of a sudden, there was an attack. The Israelis suspected there might be an attack. The Americans said, don't be the first to strike because it'll be difficult to rally the world behind you. The Israelis, idiots as they were, held back. There was an initial strike from both Egypt, in which they crossed into the Sinai. There was an attack from Syria, and the Syrians, as it was described by a lot of military specialists at West Point, they cut through the Sinai. They cut through the Golan Heights like a hot knife through butter. Right. And the only reason Israel was saved in those first 12 hours, 16 hours, was because the Syrians could not believe that they were attaining victory as quickly as they were. And they said, this is a trick, and the tanks that were coming through were stopped. They were stopped because they said, we think the Israelis are allowing us to come in so they can encircle us. And when they hesitated, the Israeli reserves were called up, and by miracle, almost as great, if not greater than the Six-Day War, Israel was able to prevail. So anyone who thinks that an initial setback is evidence of, well, this is lost, well, if that was the case, then Israel would have been destroyed in 1973. The initial response of the Ukrainians against the Russians, and they talk about how many people died and so on and so forth. Some of the Russians don't want to be there. And all of a sudden you have the so-called experts, military experts, who are optimistic. Hey, this is great. This is great. We're going to win. Let me just give you some numbers that I looked up early this morning. We've seen some of these numbers. For those of us who follow this closely, I just want to show you the disconnect of people. You mentioned something very important, Meir. You said Biden has told us we are not going to engage militarily. We will provide some stingers. They're talking about a couple hundred stingers. They're talking about a couple of the javelins for the anti-tank. Let me just give you some numbers. And I'm going to do this quickly, but just listen to the juxtaposition of the strength of the Ukrainians against the Russians. And if, in fact, the Americans who are trying to convince us are right that Putin is insane, well, there's ever more reason to be concerned, isn't there? Here, active military. We're talking about active military. We're not talking about reserves. Ukraine, 197,000. Russia, 900,000. Navy personnel. Ukraine, 15,000. Russia, 10 times that number, 150,000. Warships. Ukraine, 2. Russia, 74. Subs. Now, we all know that subs can launch some missiles, can't they? All right?
Yes.
So here we go. Subs. Ukraine, 0. Russia, 51. Now, so far, it appears to me that there's an imbalance. Let me continue with the imbalance. Army personnel, okay, a little more than twice as many in Russia without getting reserves, 900,000 to 2 million. Again, a little more than, but let's go to the tanks now. Because we're talking about the Americans didn't give them the javelin, the anti-tank weaponry and all this. Ukraine, tanks, 2,100 Russia, 13,370. Okay. Is anybody beginning to understand? Let's go artillery, 1,900 to 6,000. Armored vehicles, 2,800 to 20,000. One more thing, and this is a big one. Air Force. Personnel, 35,000 to 165,000. But put aside the personnel. Aircrafts. Now listen to this number. And the reason it's important is because the Americans and other military people have been speaking about, a no-fly zone. And they're not going to impose a no-fly zone, because what happens when the first Russian plane is shot down by who? By the French? By the Germans? Okay, well, let's look at it. Aircraft. It's about fighter jets. Fighter aircrafts for Ukraine, 146. The Russians, 1,328. So for the Ukrainians to talk about, we think we've killed 5,000 people in the first week, and they celebrating, well, it might scare some of the Russians, but it might also upset them. And the final thing is attack helicopters, which would be used in this type of conflict. 42 for the Ukrainians, 480 for the Russians. Militarily, there's an imbalance. The only way that balance can be brought to be balanced, to make it equal, is, as you mentioned, if France or if England or if Germany or if the United States would actually engage militarily. They're not going to. I know it, you know it, Putin knows it, and China knows it.
Right.
And therefore, all I'm saying is, and obviously this is not someone rooting for Putin,
Right.
But it's a recognition of, if you think all of a sudden he's gonna walk away because he's chipped his fingernail and he's gonna say, that's it, I'm not willing to engage it. These people, our so-called military experts, our political pundits on television and CNN and MSNBC, what have you, they're idiots.
Mm-hmm.
They're idiots. They don't understand that this is a fight. Now, he understood that there was going to be some kind of challenge. And perhaps it's much greater than he thought. But he's not going to walk away and say, okay, guys, you win. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I'm looking at the clock, Meir, and forgive me, I have to leave soon because next Sunday I'm emceeing a political debate here in Arizona. I'm going to be the MC, and there's a conference call that I have to be part of in 15 minutes. If I may.
So one more question. One more question.
No. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So rather Biden, he goes on about his sanction campaign. Seems to appeal to some people.
Yeah.
But then he's purchasing the oil from
600,000 barrels a day.
Now, how come when Trump made the United States self-sufficient, oil independence, he cut that off in the first week, I think.
That's right.
Now he's dependent on Russia. So it's like he's aiding and abetting, actually. Like he's saying we're imposing sanctions, but we're going to give Russia all kinds of money nonstop.
Right. We are being lied to. I've often opened a speech or a radio show that I do with politicians lie. Yes, they sometimes lie. I mean, it's a remarkable thing. But what you said is right. Right today, as we speak, the Americans are purchasing 600,000 barrels a day from the Russians. That produces $74 million a day. That's $74 million a day. Last year, 2021, which was Biden's first year as president, the United States purchased, here it is, the United States purchased 245 million barrels of oil from Russia, which cost them, this is money that went into the coffers, which is basically financing the Russian incursion at $17.4 billion. So yes, you're absolutely right. No one sees the absolute duplicity, the hypocrisy, the lie that we're being served. When asked, by the way, why is the United States doing that? Today, John Kirby, spokesman for the Defense Department, said, well, and it was this gibberish where almost like Kamala Harris-like, where if you continue to sort of just keep talking and not saying anything, it'll sound like some convoluted answer. Well, there are a couple of things and economic issues, and we do this, and at the end you go, what did he say? He didn't. All he wanted you to do is nod your head and say, okay. The Americans have in fact financed this Russian incursion into, the Americans were self-sufficient completely. The Americans produced more oil when Trump was president than they actually used. They were selling oil. At whose cost? At the expense of the Russians. At the expense of the Russians. Anyhow, yes, what you bring up is an important point, and we have to understand that the people who we've entrusted to be our leaders are not leading us. They are misleading us. And again, and forgive me, I just want to, if I may, I want to bring this back home to what I was talking about when I mentioned the connection to Iran. For me, the most important connection is to Iran and to what's going to happen with Israel tomorrow. So allow me to do this, if I may. You've always been generous in the past and asked me if there's a parting comment that I want to make, and I'd like to make the comment, and I'm going to show, this is the book. It's a book from 1943. It's a book called The Forgotten Ally. The Forgotten Ally, it's a book from Pierre van Passan, okay, a Dutch journalist, a wonderful guy, very pro-Jewish in 1943. And I go to page 23, and this is what he wrote. Mind you, this is 1943, at a time when the Holocaust had already taken full measure in scope.
Right.
And they were talking about the fact that the poor Jews in Europe, many of them rounded up, million of them at the time, 2.5 million dead already, more than 2.5 million. And there are those people who said, you mentioned AIPAC, you mentioned, well, what's going to happen with Israel? What's going to happen when Iran all of a sudden decides it's going to attack Israel? Israel, of course, has the capability to strike back. Seymour Hersh, a writer for the New York Times 20 years ago, wrote a book, The Samson Option, in which he basically said Israel is, the notion of Samson bringing the pillars down. Israel's not going to go down alone. But yet you've got American Jewish groups, you've got liberals, you've got Europeans who say, well, and you've got Americans saying, we won't allow that to happen to Israel. Israel, you have an ally in us. We'll be there for you. We will be there for you. And the best response to that is a long paragraph, if you would permit me to read it. And I think it puts it all in perspective.
Sure.
Okay? All right. This is the sentence. This is the paragraph that was written then about the fact that Jews in Europe actually believed that good-willed people were going to come and support them. This was 1943. And we know how this movie ends. But this is what he wrote at the time. And this is a real Philo-Semite, a true friend of the Jews. Here's what he wrote. I met Jewish leaders in those countries, brave men and sound Democrats, who insisted that the Jews must nevertheless stand firm, not run away, but rather ally themselves with all the forward-looking elements in the nations among whom their lot had cast them, and fight it out. But the political allies they acquired that way always deserted the Jew in the moment of danger or whenever opportunism dictated. When the final showdown came, after Hitler's accession to power, there was none to stand by the Jews, not one. All the liberalism, all the sonorous phrases about democracy and equality of races and goodwill went for naught. And the Polish and Romanian equivalents of the National Conference for Christians and Jews evaporated like snow in a summer day's sun. Those who still wanted to see right done, a few revolutionary Christians and a few heroic socialists, went with the Jews into the concentration camps and into death. Anyone who believes, we've seen the Ukrainians, yes, the Ukrainians say, we want to thank President Biden, we want to thank him. Behind the scenes, we've heard what they're saying. Where are you? Where are you?
Yep.
Where are you?
Yep.
Well, let me tell you, the Ukrainians have been given a lot more support than Israel will ever be given if the situation was ever turned against Israel.
Right.
What's the answer? The answer is for Israel not to be weak-kneed. The answer is for Israel to send a message, which they don't do. In fact, the present left-leaning Israeli government has actually come out and said, no secrets was the phrase. We won't surprise the United States by striking against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Right. We will trust you, Joe Biden. We will trust you to make sure that the Iranians don't get the bomb. The only difference, and this is an important point that underscores everything that you and I believe in, Meir. Yeah. The only difference between 1943 and today is the Israelis can take care of themselves if they have the resolve to do it.
Right.
Then, resolve or no resolve, they couldn't have done anything about it. Today, they can. And Israel needs to send a message loud and clear. The Iranians, Israel has said, it's a euphemism. We won't allow the Islamic bomb. We won't allow it. And once they have it, what are you going to do? Israel needs to send a message to the Western world, to China, to France, to Germany, to the United States, to CNN. We will destroy the Iranian capability because we don't trust you.
Let me add to that. Israel needs to cut the bullshit, and and people like Lapid and Bennett have to rise to the occasion ahead of their egos and say, we need a national emergency government now. Bring in the right people. And that's it.
Will not happen.
Well, I'm just saying.
Yeah, you're right. What ought to be and what will be are not the same thing.
Right.
You're right. I apologize. I very much I appreciate your pulling me in. I just had a previous commitment. I even pushed the commitment back, whatever. But I appreciate it. I thank you very much, and I hope.
Thank you very much for joining us. We'll have you on again. And when I'm in Israel, I'll be doing the podcast from there. I'll have you on, and it'll be great.
God bless you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Meir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let me just check the comments. If anybody has any questions, I'll do my best to address it. Our doctor in the studio.
Hey, Meir.
Something you want to add to there's a lot of different memes. It's been a
well, I mean, there's so much going on.
Very deep show. That's what we're talking about.
Not to make fun, but just in case if anybody hasn't yet had the opportunity to see this satire, I know we showed it on our last show. I thought the sanction deal. It's just take a minute break. This is very serious. There's nothing comical, but I think there's always a little room for a little satire.
Yeah, definitely.
President Zelensky, the United States is committed to the security of Ukraine and its people.
Say, Mr. President, bite.
We will stop Putin with our most powerful weapon.
Oh, Игезман.
Diplomacy.
Серьезно ли? Я что ты танк Руси бы хотел, блядь?
Now I'm really pissed off. I'll bomb them.
Все.
With sanctions.
Вот вам санкшн, ума батили шинанит, мама гре.
Now you, Prime Minister Benetsky.
Bennett.
Of course. The United States is committed to the security of Israel and its people.
כן, על זה רציתי לדבר איתך. איך אנחנו עוצרים את האיראנים?
Don't worry. When it comes to Iran, they understand only one thing.
נכון מאוד.
Diplomacy.
הלך עליכם, בלד.
זה לא שלי.
סליחה. Аля, я сговорить не хочу. Почему? Спасибо. מסתבר שאין לי הרברה, אולי יש לכם פה מישהו להלוות?
This is so funny, I'm telling you this. You know, he was a comedian. Oh, or maybe You're the comedian, right? Because you look funny, you're like bald and you have these weird teeth.
ג'ון, תתרכז. אני מישראל, והוא מאוקראינה מחבל הבדרנים. עכשיו, מה עושים עם איראן?
Oh, don't worry. You have my word. Iran will never invade Ukraine.
Israel.
Of course,
כן.
of course. Russia will never Ukraine Israel.
What is particularly interesting is this is satire, yet he went in a State of the Union address and said exactly what they just said, that he's confusing Iran with Ukraine. So let's watch the rest of this little video.
Hey, relax. If Iran will attack,
כן.
there will be sanctions.
עוד פעם סקשן.
כל הזמן סקשן.
Yeah, well, you won't be there because you will be dead. But we'll take their iPhones. I'm telling you this. They will always have Xiaomi.
You need the...
I'm fine.
It's okay?
I'm fine.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Slow.
Yeah, I'm tight as a tambourine.
Okay.
Now, let's take a nice picture for history.
Yes, let's
Yeah,
go.
my dear.
Come Ukraine.
Israel.
Come Israel. Of course. Now shake his hand now. I pronounce you husband and wife.
Okay.
Then, of course, that is the deal. This is not. There's nothing funny about this. Biden is actually requesting Putin's guidance in negotiating an Iran nuclear deal. I mean, if this wasn't satirical and wasn't so serious, it would be funny, but it's certainly not. One thing also, which I mentioned on the last show, is there is a interesting theory, and it's available. It's called political punerology. And basically, if I could find the caption, let's see, that's not what I was looking for. So let's close that out, bring that back. And so political punerology, what it is, it's the study of how leaders universally, doesn't matter if you talk about kings, sheiks, emirs, some presidents, they suffer from narcissism, from an antisocial personality disorder. And this book, if anybody wants to get a hold of it, you can find it on any book site. Again, I have no vested interest in this, but what it does basically, the entire theory epitomizes Putin. It uses psychology and history to explain the narcissistic, psychopathic behavior of evil political leaders. And I think it really is must reading. It was first written in the 1880s by a sociologist from Poland. It was then banned and it was torn up and burned. It wasn't republished until the 1980s. So just anybody who has a chance, take that down, go and you won't regret reading it. So back to you, Meir.
Well, listen, everyone, our viewers, we're living in historic times. These are unprecedented. One thing after another, we have a crisis with Corona. We're being told all kinds of information, disinformation as well. And then we have Afghanistan. We saw the failure of the Biden administration. And political correctness. Now we have, again, a complete failure of the Biden administration when it came to what is happening right now in front of our eyes with the Ukraine. And Biden is negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran. Well, as a Jew, we can't trust him. We can't trust anyone that's negotiating with our lives. And we have to be unified. We have to speak the truth. And on the issue of Iran, actually, let me back up. On the issue of the Ukraine, it actually bothers me that there are some Jews, some members in the Jewish community that want to volunteer and go to the Ukraine and fight for the Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying Putin should, I'm not for Putin invading Iran, or, the Ukraine at all. Yeah, I'd like to see Putin invade Iran and stop them. Yes, no question. I don't see that happening. But the Ukraine, I'm not for Putin invading the Ukraine. But it's not our fight, because we have such a history in the Ukraine of bloodshed, of being slaughtered because we're Jews. So I don't see anything be proud of. And when we see that in the government, in the Ukraine, and in the military, they have wings there, that is no secret. With the Bandera movement and with various Nazi movements, and these even have they really do have Nazi flags, not make up nonsense at the trucker rally in Ottawa. And that was complete nonsense. You label them all as fascists and Nazis and seize their bank accounts and that. No. There really is in the Ukraine. This is really going on. And the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Christina Freeland, she was at a rally, I mentioned it earlier, for the Ukraine. And she has no problem with a Bandera banner there. And the Bandera is definitely linked with Nazis. So what's she doing? And why is that being legitimized? And the progressive left, they're silent on that. Bernie Farber, he was posting like crazy about the truckers in Ottawa. They're all, they're racist and Nazis, and look at this Nazi flag and so on and so forth. I don't hear anything about Nazis supporting the Ukraine from Bernie Farber or the Bandera banner. I know his organization, Canadian Anti-Hate Network, they look at every kind of banner that's held by some organization that's on the right, what they call on the right wing. And they say, well, they waved this, or they made a hand gesture like this. This is a far right signal. It's ridiculous. It even got so ridiculous that a woke Jewish member of parliament for the Liberal Party actually said the truckers, when they honk their horns, honk, honk, that's code for Heil Hitler. But they give a pass to everything at these Ukrainian rallies. They're not honest. And we have to speak the truth. Anyways, like I said, we're living in very historic times. These are dangerous times. And we have to speak the truth. We have to unify. We have to come together. And don't listen to these failed leaders. Don't fall for the nonsense. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. Please share this. We'll see you again probably on Sunday. We'll have another show. There's always a lot to be discussed. We had some previous shows where we were talking about in the public schools, Toronto District School Board with praise for Hitler going on there, and usually a Jewish teacher that finds out about it because it happened in the Jewish community, or that's where it was reported. So therefore, it's incredibly widespread throughout the city and the Greater Toronto area and in the province and other provinces, happening in public schools. That's just not going reported. There was another incident today at a public school with swastikas. Very serious. Anti-Semitism is not dead. It's very much alive. And one more point about, Bernie Farber, who, maligns the truckers, and he made a post today. I don't know if we could show the post screenshot where he was talking about Trump supporters. Well, here's one. We have another one too. But Putin fires missiles into population centers in the Ukraine. Many, including children, die. Israel is silent. Missiles explode at Holocaust Memorial at Babi Yar, and Israel remains silent. It's time to open a mouth. Israel remains silent. Again, he likes to criticize Israel a lot to probably appeal to his friends in the Islamic community who actually say free Palestine from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. He hangs out with people like that. He's got no problem with it. He doesn't call them out. But he'll call out people on the right. these are times, don't be afraid to speak the truth. Always speak the truth and back it up. Just have the facts. That's it. The fact is, we have no time for kidding around at all. Iran's very clear. They want to drop a nuclear bomb on Israel. The movement, the BDS movement, that chants from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They want Iran to obtain nuclear arms. Again, Bernie, he's pretty quiet about that. And for some reason, CIJA, they have some kind of relationship with Bernie Farber. Erwin Kotler, who's supposed to be working on the highest level, appointed by the government to oversee anti-Semitism in Canada. He's got some kind of relationship with Bernie Farber. It's unacceptable. Unacceptable. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you again Sunday night. Thank you very much. But quite the show. I believe we probably have a song that we usually end with.
We do have a song to end with, and we played it a month or so ago. It was actually sang at various events in Israel. So let me just play this, and then we'll close up right after the song. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Again, go to israelnow.ca. Okay, that's our website, israelnow.ca. Support us or join us, like us, just be involved. So just let me tell you quickly about this little group. It's an a cappella group of a variety of young men who made Aliyah, moved to Israel. And that's my message to the Ukrainian Jews, although now I understand it's difficult and your homes are there. But my grandparents' home were there too, and they're happy to be out of there. And they've been gone for a long time. So why would anybody want to live in Ukraine? It's like Groucho Marx said, why should I want to belong to a club that doesn't want me to join? Well, why live in a country where people don't really want you? In spite of the fact the president is Jewish, that's an amazing fluke. So without any further ado, here's a nice little song to end the show with.
Oh, wow.
Left it all to be with you. Distant dreams have now come true. Walk the streets of legends told. We've come home. We've come home. We've come home. And we'll never stand alone. After 2,000 years, we are home. Not a native of this land, bring me up and take my hand. Sapphire seas and golden sand, a place called home. We've come home, we've come home to a land of our own. After 2,000 years, we are home. ארצי מולדתי, על אדמת פי צעדתי.